Oh, great. Thank you, Mark, and thank you also to FDA and to my fellow members of the Planning Board. So, agenda. There we go. So the Planning Board was charged with really designing and envisioning a 21st century system for medical device, both development, innovation, and post-market surveillance. And we really see the system that we're proposing here today as an essential component of an emerging national healthcare information infrastructure. We focused in our recommendations on a collaborative system that supports the development, regulation, and use of innovative devices. The system that we envision should be able to accurately, systematically evaluate potential medical device safety signals in near real time, measure the risk-benefit profile of a device throughout its entire life cycle, and be able to develop information that supports pre- and post-market regulatory decision-making. We believe that data capture should be an integral part of healthcare. This will minimize burden. We think it is essential to do so. The desire to improve public health and patient care are the key drivers for the system that we propose, and the data within the system should support a broad range of evidentiary needs. In developing the report, we identified a set of assumptions about progress that we think will take place over the next decade. We believe that the country is moving towards a learning healthcare system, one in which healthcare is more personalized for individuals to meet their specific needs. A central capability of such a system is to be able to capture the patient's perspective to better inform and improve the ongoing delivery of care to them. We also assume that the shift towards more personalized care will incentivize the development of better evidence, and that payment for medical services will increasingly be tied to results. The Planning Board also made a number of assumptions about a very rapidly evolving health IT environment. We assumed that within a decade, that collection of UDI data and connecting it to patients will be an integral part of healthcare. We also assumed that EHRs holding UDIs will be widely available across the healthcare environment, and that different but interoperable health information systems will support the linkages of that key data on behalf of patients. We also realize that as a multi-stakeholder partnership, that for this system to succeed, it has to earn and maintain the support of all the major stakeholders that are already engaged in post-market medical device surveillance. And those stakeholders, which you will hear from a number of them today, include patients at the center, clinicians, healthcare organizations, manufacturers of medical devices, payers and providers, the medical device industry, and government agencies, and others. The mission of the medical device post-market surveillance system, what we will call MIDS, is given to you here. And it's our belief that the system that is based on this mission to fulfill this mission should really serve as a central hub to coordinate national efforts and to generate information about the devices that are used by patients and clinicians. The information generated should address and meet high-priority public health goals and healthcare needs. Potential uses of the system include providing better information to patients, clinicians, health systems, and payers, being able to inform CDRH's regulatory activities so that they are able to ensure safety while at the same time accelerate product innovation, and be able to really facilitate the pre-market approval and clearance processes and the expansion of indications for already approved devices. The system should mitigate potential harms by supporting a rapid response when device safety problems are detected, and it should gather information about existing products so that that information can inform new product development and innovation. And most of all, perhaps, is the goal of improving health outcomes, but improving them by supporting decision-making that is informed by real-time, real-world experiences with medical devices. If we then look at some of the guiding principles, we'll be guided by FDA surveillance priorities, of course. This will be a clinician and patient-centered or focused system. It should be integrated into larger national efforts. This is not standalone. It will be a multi-stakeholder collaboration. It will be forward-looking, and we assume and expect that it will continue to evolve. There will be clear expectations for transparent communication. We will focus on maximizing utility, minimizing burden, and be profoundly respectful of the need to protect patient privacy and their data. Its primary function will be to provide better evidence, of course, to support all the activities that I have mentioned. Secondary functions will be the expectation, really, to collaborate with others to meet shared high-priority evidence needs. If we then look at those objectives and consider them more carefully, being an integral component of a broad healthcare infrastructure is critical. We will be part of, but not the whole answer, in terms of identifying current and emerging activities and coordinating those efforts across the healthcare ecosystem. The system should develop a data infrastructure that is part of and consistent with and aligned with the health information systems that we see developing around us. And it should leverage interoperability standards. The system should rely upon, should welcome, should use external expertise, collaborate with data partners, leverage existing efforts, and avoid duplication. We envision a system that collects data in a tiered fashion so that Tier 1 would be a relatively small core set of data elements. Tier 2 would link that data to clinical information that may come from EHRs and from registries, and Tier 3 will link to more detailed device and/or clinical care registries. If we then consider what such a system would look like, we, as has been said, think that the system should be a public-private partnership. It should be implemented and managed that way, and it needs to have sufficient authority and funding to support its activities. We selected this model because the success of this system requires the ongoing active engagement of many. CDRH, of course, but the private sector equally so. And we believe that there is no single stakeholder, either federal or private, that could individually successfully build and maintain this system by itself. So as such, we also, though, don't see this as a standalone, but we see it as a coordinating function amongst very highly respected, well-developed, very productive, ongoing activities, as well as those that we expect to see developing over the next several years. And by serving in that coordination function, by deploying assets and infrastructure that are available across the ecosystem, we think this will be a key element of reducing costs and minimizing duplication, but at the same time maximizing the sharing of expertise. The governance principles are critical to the success of this system. We think that it will be built upon strong relationships that are based on trust amongst the key stakeholders. We think that trust will be fostered by having transparent and representative governance. We envision that there will be governance principles quickly put into place that will address conflicts of interest and mitigate their effects, assure transparent operations, develop reliable methods, and promote sustained participation. In terms of the organizational components, which you will see here, key is data infrastructure, which is a coordinating function of a large number of already existing and soon to be developing data infrastructure partners. And as a long-term goal, being able to establish the infrastructure board so that it is working with and fosters interoperable data sources and their use by many. The coordinating center will be responsible for stakeholder engagement and external engagement. It will work with and leverage the experience of external evidence developing organizations to be able to leverage their contributions. The coordinating centers will also identify organizations that will want and use, for the benefit of all, the data that is collected within the system. And the stakeholder engagement unit will be responsible for having that ongoing communication between the system and all of its stakeholders, identified now, those in the future, to be able to ensure that this is an active live system that is put in place. The Planning Board recognizes that the system will require significant financial resources to be sustainable. We also realize that there will need to be mechanisms in place to be able to provide resources, both financial as well as in-kind support, to data partners to encourage their participation. It needs to be explicit to them that there is value to participation in this system and to doing something perhaps different than what they're currently doing. And that we also believe that initially there will be a need for public funding to establish the system that we described for you today. So I'm now pleased to turn things over to my fellow Planning Board member, Mark Overhage, and he'll discuss with you the next steps.
Well, this is all easy, right? The Planning Board obviously had, as Mark said, only about 9 months to do its work, and I was amazed and impressed with the degree of depth that we explored a variety of the challenges that had to be met to evolve this system. And you might think of those in 3 buckets. The data infrastructure, which you heard a bit about, the methodological challenges related to how to leverage that data to the many purposes that Jeff Shuren identified, and creating value for patients and other stakeholders so that there is a sustainable business model for the operation that takes advantage of the ecosystem of end users around these tools and systems. So as meeting these challenges, we think will require a variety of steps moving forward. A specific program design for the public-private partnership that was described, probably pilots, which I'll say more about in a moment, and potentially working to evolve policy in the direction to support the operations of such a system. MIDS should attempt to leverage existing building blocks, and I think Kathy said that we need to underscore that, and be focused on scalable and generalizable approaches that build long-term capabilities of the system. So for example, the system should build on and coordinate with existing programs to minimize costs and make the best use of public and private resources. So the steps forward that the Planning Board, or the strategies forward that the Planning Board recommends, are a 2-phased approach. The first is, you can think of as an incubation phase, really taking these very complex set of issues and taking the direction that we've narrowed down of the many options and starting to refine those into specific tactical steps to operationalize this system. And one of the key activities in that first phase that we expect to take 1 to 2 years is to develop a robust plan for implementation of the MDS system. The plan at a minimum should include recommendations for developing the core system capabilities and recommendations for the public-private partnership organizational implementation. In order to develop the core system capabilities, there are a variety of activities that we think need to be incorporated into plan, including defining the framework for the MDS implementation, identifying and starting to build the real relationships with the key partner organizations, making sure that the mechanisms to provide patient privacy and confidentiality protections are evolved and put in place from the beginning, and identifying and prioritizing pilot projects that will start to inform the process while building momentum for the MDS at the same time. In terms of the public-private partnership organizational implementation, there'll be some key decisions to be made. For example, such as who would be the potential organizations to host the operations of the MDS public-private partnership, mechanisms for selecting the MDS leadership, management and operational framework for MDS, including the staffing and information technology needs, and developing more refined financial projections, including budgets and potential funding sources. And finally, establishing good and solid transparency and communication strategy, something that the board's really spent a lot of time thinking and talking about, ensuring that happen because it's so critical to the success. We do think that during this time, it's not a just planning and operations time, but pilot projects are an important part of this incubation period. These targeted pilots should be used to inform more specific plans on how the MDS can best be implemented, as well as start building the foundation of a data infrastructure. And there were 3 specific pilots that the board recommends we start with. First, our clinical data system supporting device safety surveillance. Second, development of tools for routine surveillance of implantable device safety. And third, implantable device surveillance using patient-reported information. We think these pilots will help build on existing work being done in a variety of organizations, including MD EpiNet and the Registries Task Force. On the basis of that plan, that's during that incubation period, that implementation phase that we expect to be at least 5 years, the first step would be selection of a founding governing board and the members of its executive committee, which would actually instantiate and operationalize the public-private partnership. Then, guided by the plan, the governing board would set and oversee the strategic development priorities, and the staff in the host organization would start to build and maintain the broader stakeholder participation that's required, establishing the partnerships with other evidence development organizations and data partners, and developing the policies to ensure that the patient's privacy is protected. This is may seem like a fairly broad set of directions, but it's actually quite narrowed down from the range of possibilities that the board explored. And I hope that we've struck in the board the right directionality and some specific enough steps to begin action while taking into account the level of certainty around the variety of moving parts exist. And we really look forward to your comments today and over the coming months to help refine and improve this plan as we solve this very hard problem. So thanks very much for your attention this morning. I'll turn it back over to Mark.
All right, Mark, thank you very much for those comments. Kathy as well covered a great deal of information and content in the report in a limited period of time. Again, the report itself is available online on our website right now for anyone who wants to look at it in more depth. Right now, I would like to invite up the panelists for our next session onto the stage. While they're coming up, I'm going to introduce them. They've all had extensive careers related to medical devices and using them to improve the lives of patients here in the United States and around the world. The order that we'll be hearing them from is the order that I'm going to introduce them. First, Omar Ishrak is the chairman and CEO of Medtronic, and Medtronic, as you all know, has implemented a number of steps to take on the same kind of life cycle approach of continuous evidence development that you heard described by Jeff Shuren earlier. Bill Murray is the president and CEO of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which is a collaborative effort to help overcome some of the challenges in medical device innovation, such as providing more clarity about gathering evidence on benefits and risks to patients. Lou Sandy is the executive vice president of clinical advancement at United Healthcare, where Lou has been involved in a wide range of activities focusing on getting more value in the healthcare system, including through developing better evidence, both collaboratively and in efforts underway at United. Alan Guttmacher is the director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at the National Institutes of Health, where he has been involved in leading a range of efforts around better post-market evidence, including evidence on the effects of devices in children, and he's also been involved in the recently announced Precision Medicine Initiative. It was part of the President's State of the Union address. Alan Balch is the CEO of the Patient Advocate Foundation, a foundation that I think he'll describe in a little bit more detail to you, that focuses on patient centricity in the healthcare system and in further policy steps like the ones that we're describing today. And Jody Daniel is the director of the Office of Policy for the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, where she's been involved in a range of issues related to using interoperability and electronic systems to support better evidence, and has been very much involved in the recently announced ONC interoperability roadmap. So we're going to be hearing individually from each of these perspectives on the report that you've just heard been described, and we're going to have some time for a discussion, including discussion involving all of you here in the room. So Omar, let me turn to you first. Kick off with some initial comments on the report, please.
Good, thank you. Look, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd also like to congratulate the members who put this report together. And it's a lot of work done over a very short period of time, and it covers a lot of guiding principles that I think we can all rally around. Let me summarize some of those to start with. Something that's important to, I think, most device manufacturers. First, and actually the whole ecosystem itself, the comprehensiveness of a system like this, need for that is quite clear. It's going to be patient-friendly, and it's going to be doctor-friendly, so that people actually use it, and it can be scaled in that fashion. To do that effectively, I think the only pragmatic way to do this is to make sure that there's a real linkage to EHR systems, because there's already been a heavy investment in that area. They already carry a lot of data, and to, for lack of a better word, modify them or upgrade them to include more data fields to cover the sorts of areas that we've talked about this morning seems like a reasonable approach. The second important point certainly from a device manufacturer perspective, but really from everyone's perspective, and something that's been touched on, but I just want to emphasize the importance, is the importance of transparency and immediate availability of this data. You cannot have any manufacturer be in the dark while this data is collected by somebody and then produced when something happens. I mean, first, that's not responsible, and second, no one's going to accept that. So transparency is pretty important, and immediate availability is very important. And from a manufacturer perspective, the other side of the coin is true as well, in that if it's transparent, then everyone should have access to it. Now, the things that you've got to watch when data is transparent in such a fashion is the standardization of the data and standardization of the analytics that govern that data. Because although in the long term, credibility will arise from the nature of the reports that come out of analyzing this set of data. In the short term, you can get abuse, or you can get unintended abuse of extrapolation of views that may or may not be accurate, and can create a whole series of problems which are completely unintended and distracts from the whole affair. Third, and something that's also been touched on, is the importance of providing effectiveness and cost data as well as safety. I think if you're going to build a system like this, it's going to be comprehensive, and that comprehensiveness must mean that the benefit, financial as well as clinical, is covered through the system. And I think that's a very important point, because there's a parallel movement which should be somehow coordinated or even integrated with this effort, and that's the movement towards value-based healthcare. Value-based healthcare is basically saying that one should get paid for outcomes. Well, outcomes means you understand the efficacy, and you understand the cost, and you understand the safety profiles of what you're going to do. So including cost, I think, should be a pretty fundamental requirement, which takes me to my final point, which is discussing, how does one pay for this? And, we talked about many different angles at this. We talked about public-private partnerships, but let me tell you this, that if you want something to get paid for, in essence, an investment that's to be made, you've got to have a return on that investment. And you've got to be granular about where that financial return is. And this cannot be, investment and then a qualitative return. You might get some people whose arms are twisted to invest in that, but you will not get enthusiastic endorsement unless you see a real financial return. And so a real effort into granularizing that financial return to who gets it and when it happens is very important if you want heavy investment in this area. For that reason, I think while building a scalable system and having certain principles around the standardization, one should really pick off certain areas of priority where one can see line of sight to that return, whether it be because device approvals are accelerated because everyone is on the same page regarding the value of such a system, and therefore because the device approval is accelerated, there'll be a willingness to invest because the financial return will be obvious. Or is it because you get a lower cost in some other fashion because of some kind of incremental innovation? All of that would work. The other angle would be that is there a way in which we can replace the cost of existing systems? The existing complaint handling systems and so on are suboptimal. Can we find a way to replace those and transition the cost of doing that activity with an activity that's more around overall surveillance that includes all the elements that we talked about? There are obviously issues with that because, going from one system to another, you cannot just drop one and go to another because, there are certain things that a complaint handling system does cover, and you cannot suddenly shut that down from everyone's perspective. So the transition of that is something that has to be worked through carefully. I think finally, you've got to get payers involved in this to get the payment system involved so that that's really the only way in which you can get a financial look at this. A financial look from an overall perspective, I think, is of the most. I think that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Omar, thank you very much. I'll turn next to Bill.
Thank you, Mark. And I, too, would like to thank the Brookings Institute, Mark, and the Planning Board for the generation of this important report. Medical Device Innovation Consortium is a public-private partnership between government, including NIH, CMS, and FDA, industry, and nonprofits. Our mission is to advance regulatory science throughout the total product lifecycle for the benefit of patients. This includes pre-market as well as post-market activities. Our work is grounded in clinical science and engineering. Robust post-market real-world evidence is an important tool in advancing regulatory science. In particular, this, as Jeff mentioned earlier, allows us to rebalance our pre-market and post-market requirements, and we think that will help advance getting safe, effective devices to market earlier. In addition, it can help inform clinical trial designs for future innovations as real-world evidence is and context of use is incorporated into the benefit-risk decisions. This spring, MDIC will be publishing a framework report on research that we've been working with in coordination with FDA and other stakeholders on incorporating patient benefit risk decision-making into clinical trials. And we think that a post-market surveillance system can help further that work and can be an important additional tool in this area. We also believe that an effective real-world post-market evidence system will reduce time and resources needed for development, assessment, and review as these tools and methods are incorporated into both the development and in the review process. And finally, we believe it can inform reimbursement decisions as evidence of value becomes part of the information that's provided. A number of people already said this, but obviously the concept is highly appealing. The reality of implementation, though, is complex, and so developing a clear value proposition for all stakeholders will be very important. We agree with a couple of the key points in the Planning Board's implementation approach, to start with fact-finding and pilot programs. I pulled up a data point. Back in 2009, CDC did a survey of national hospital discharges. There were 48 million inpatient procedures. We have to obviously prioritize areas where there'll be high-value opportunities from all the stakeholders involved. And so developing a clear and measurable value proposition will be important. And then ultimately defining implementation plans for those technologies and therapies where benefit risk and evidence of value framework can be identified. A multi-stakeholder partnership, we believe, is the approach to do that with active engagement from FDA. Workflow as well at point of care will be very important. We've seen in the medical device industry the challenge with post-approval registries is oftentimes they're very cumbersome, difficult to implement, and costly, not only for the manufacturers, but for the caregivers and the patients. So having a system that is a balance of approaches where standard data needs can be provided will be important. And this integrated system with infrastructures with these goals that have a clear evidence of value will be very important for adoption, not only for the manufacturers, but also for the frontline providers and the patients, which is a very key consideration. I'd also like to bring up a couple additional considerations that I think are important. Omar touched on part of it, but real-time transparent access to medical device performance will require a new paradigm for stakeholder engagement and communication. Early data trends may not always be clear, and understanding what the data are telling us and translating that information into relevant and actionable activities will be important. This can often take time, so the early trends and indications may not always be ultimately clear on what the implications are. So remaining diligent in analysis of data and coordinated in communication will be important. Again, I think an opportunity as we go forward with some of the research that has started in the clinical phase with patient-centered benefit risk can be important additional activity as we look at this in the post-market place where we can take and extend on benefit risk decision making with both patient and caregiver communications. We think this is an important area. Second, post-market data can have a major impact on future innovation. Significant value can be realized by utilizing information to inform data-driven first principle regulatory science work. So what we're talking about here is not only how to use this to inform the performance of the existing products, but how then to feed that back into development of new technologies. We think that's extremely important. Robust real-world data used to develop new design tools, methods, and processes will help not only for product development, but also for the product assessment activity. For example, improved computer models and simulations used in development that can be used to evaluate new designs, especially in those areas where empirical testing in vivo may not be fully adequate. And there's a number of examples with sophisticated new technologies where it's not always feasible to do testing of all attributes of the device in humans. So we believe that modeling and simulation can be an important tool to help inform future decisions in device development and assessment. And it will be very important for future innovations as we go forward. So thank you for the opportunity to participate. I look forward to a robust discussion on this topic.
All right, Bill, thank you very much. And go on to Lou now. Thanks.
Well, thanks. I, too, appreciate the chance to react to this important project and this event. You know, I come at this from a couple of perspectives. Mark introduced me as from United Healthcare, and I think most of you know United Health Group has a large benefit business. United Healthcare, about 46 million lives. But we also have Optum, our health services company, which serves all the stakeholders in healthcare, about 80 million people. And Optum participates in the FDA Sentinel program as a collaborator. So I bring that perspective, not only a payer perspective, but also a surveillance and a safety perspective as well. I think the first point is absolutely we need a more robust post-market surveillance system, and we need it for multiple reasons. You've already heard several people say that. Safety is paramount, but not only for safety. And I think the most important thing I think we need, and Jeff mentioned this in his comments, is what we need is what I would call real-world evidence. We need evidence about how devices work in the real world, not just in trials, and not just in carefully selected patients, but in actual real-world settings. And we need other kinds of information besides safety, such as appropriateness, cost, comparative effectiveness. Omar, I agree with your comments. We need to know a lot about patient selection. Who is getting these devices? And we need to know much more. We have very limited infrastructure on patient-reported outcomes. I think that's really critical as well. The other piece about this report, and Omar touched on this as well, is we need to understand that this is not happening in a vacuum in terms of payment and delivery reform. There is a very rapid and robust transformation of the payment system and the delivery system to pay for value, which raises the question, how do you define value? And in whose eyes is that value calculus being done? And I think, you know, again, probably the most important thing in that transformation is it is not only the payer's point of view that makes that is important. As payment models move to hold delivery systems accountable for cost, quality, and patient experience outcomes, the delivery system's view about value is going to be important. And also, as patients are more empowered As patients have more financial exposure because of changes in benefit structure, the patient's point of view is going to be critically important as well. You know, and just to drive it home, this is not a theoretical exercise. Some of you may know about an organization that we started as a joint venture along with some delivery system partners called Shared Clarity. Shared Clarity is a joint venture that is doing exactly what this system is supposed to be doing, is being designed to do. It's a joint venture between United Healthcare and delivery systems to actually do the kind of comparative effectiveness analysis that is sorely needed, and this system will respond to. And so I think that shows it's not theoretical. It's practical, and it's here now. The demand is here now. So I think I totally agree with the need for this. It's critically important. But I do have a few comments in closing to the report. I think the most important thing from a data infrastructure point of view, Mark mentioned this and Kathy as well, is being able to connect individual device identification information in an electronic format to an individual patient. That information infrastructure can be used for multiple purposes. How exactly to do that, how exactly to connect the UDI to an individual patient identifier has to be worked out, whether it's through electronic health records, through claims, through some cloud-based architecture, through registries. I think that's critically important. And then the report also spends a lot of time focusing, appropriately so, on high-level principles and governance, which is great, but I think we all know that the devil's in the details here. What is the scope of this activity? How will it be financed? Who owns the data? Who has access to the data? How's it going to be paid for? I think one of the things I'm struck, your comments, Alan, we know, for example, in the drug surveillance experience, sometimes a safety signal pops up, a sort of possible one, and then when you do analysis, you actually find there's no safety issue at all. Well, how would that work in a real-time device-oriented infrastructure? I can just imagine in this world of Twitter and CNN what is going to happen to devices and manufacturers in that system. That really has to be worked out. Last thing is I just completely commend and applaud the approach of using pilots, of phasing it in. Jeff mentioned pragmatic. That is absolutely right. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Start doing some things, and I agree with Omar, that actually show this can work, show there's a tangible return. That'll build both momentum and energy for collaboration. So thank you. I appreciate the chance to share those perspectives, and we'll go from there. Alan.
All right, Lou, thanks very much, and go on to Alan.
And I'm really going to speak, I think, from three perspectives, but still observe the time limits. The first is from an NIH perspective, the second is from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and the third is from a personal perspective. From all three of those perspectives, I would say that this is really a wonderful effort. I would commend both Brookings, the FDA for driving this, and the group that put it together for, I think, a really useful, forward-looking kind of proposal. From an NIH point of view, I think, in fact, I'm going to quote from the report on page 21. There's a really very good section, which I think briefly captures in a nut what the NIH is about in terms of this kind of thing and how the NIH should really relate to the MDS. It reads, the MDS could support the research activities of public health authorities and other public sector organizations such as the NIH. The NIH supports development, design, testing, clinical evaluation, and implementation of medical devices as part of its mission. A flexible registry-based system could provide rapid access to clinical populations to accelerate proof of concept trials and to test expanded indications for existing devices. Registry data could also provide the basis for hypothesis generation and support scientific investigation. An enhanced post-market surveillance system could also facilitate research to identify and ameliorate the root causes of adverse events and device malfunctions. I really think that encapsulates it very well. I think one way to think about this is that for the MDS to be optimal in terms of what it seeks to do, for the NIH to work optimally, and for device development in our country to work optimally, The NIH really needs to be an integral partner in this, clearly under the leadership of the FDA, but working closely. And we clearly, in terms of the governments that's talked about in the document, et cetera, I think those kinds of ideas are really welcome and wonderful ones. Let me say something from the NICHD specifically. Part of our warrant is to be in some way the focus at NIH for research involving both women and children. And pregnant women and children, I think when it comes, as many folks in this room know, when it comes to device design, deployment, et cetera, and certainly in terms of follow-up as well, have some special kinds of concerns. The issues of safety, of course, are more complex for both pregnant women and children. The fact that children have this nasty habit of growing physically creates certain challenges in terms of devices. The fact that the market is often a very small one, whether we're talking about pregnant women or children, of course, creates other challenges. So I think, and the toxicities can be particular in these particular circumstances. So as this system is designed, I think it's important that pregnant women and children be considered from the get-go as one of the user populations. Another research focus that we have at NICHD is rehabilitation medicine. And while I think those who are using devices for rehabilitation reasons perhaps are not a unique population, they're a distinctive one, in that, as is true of some other individuals, they will be using devices for very, very long-term periods often. And I think it's, again, a real advantage of the kind of system that's sketched in the report to have the true longitudinal long-term follow-up to really understand the implications of having devices for years and years. So finally, as a personal note, as someone who's had a device for years and years, as someone who's had a pacemaker defibrillator living in my chest wall for the last 15 years, I'd make several points. One is, I think the report nicely talks about the importance of the patient perspective. And it really is important, and I would emphasize it needs to be built in from the beginning. When we think about, who are the end users for medical devices, I think we often think of we medical providers who put them in, because we often guide, of course, decisions about who will have a device, et cetera, and which device. But in fact, the end user is actually the patient. And I can tell you, as someone who's put in devices and someone who's had devices put in, those are two different perspectives. And the perspective of the end user, I think, is very important that it be part of this to begin with. Another point that I would make is, as someone who had his defibrillator put in 15 years ago, had a rather rudimentary discussion with the cardiologist who wanted to put it in about the risks and benefits. I can imagine that this kind of system would lead to much more informed discussions than the one I had in the future, which would be quite welcome. And then finally, as someone whose life has been saved a couple of times by my device, but also has had an experience where a device malfunction created some financial, physical, and I guess psychic costs for myself, I don't see this in the report, but I think it's an important point that for those of us who have these devices, if you should have a misadventure at some point, I think it will make you feel much better about the misadventure if you know that that is going into a surveillance system that will inform future device design, use, and in fact improve devices and patient lives. I would have felt better had I had great confidence that that was the case. So again, from all of those perspectives, I think it's a wonderful report, and I guess maybe I've been a segue to the other Alan on the panel, talk more about the patient perspective.
Well, thank you for that segue, and I apologize for messing up the nice order that we had until you got to me.
Quite all right.
Thank you. Well, let me very briefly describe the organizations I represent so you know the perspective from whence I speak. I work as the CEO for the Patient Advocate Foundation and the National Patient Advocate Foundation. At the Patient Advocate Foundation, we provide direct support to patients who have chronic, life-threatening, and debilitating diseases. We serve about 100,000 patients a year, and we do that through either some form of direct financial support, which is the primary reason for any of those who serve patients out there, the number one thing that most patients are struggling with is the financial component of their care. The other issue that we help quite frequently with is with access to care issues, and that covers a range of different fronts. So we actually do some help with patients who have devices or trying to get access to devices thanks to the support from PASIC-centric organizations like Edwards Life Sciences. So what we do in that process is we really focus on trying to help one patient at a time. And what we do in that engagement with them is try to collect a lot of data information about what they're experiencing and the barriers they're engaging and confronting in the system. And as you can imagine, as you replicate that tens of thousands of times over, you collect a lot of knowledge about what's happening in very real time. We then try to translate that as best we can into opportunities for advocacy and policies so that we can scale up that one-at-a-time experience and actually look for ways to help patients on a much broader scale. So with that, when we look at these types of reports, and thank you for the opportunity to respond, there's really three key flashpoints that we look for, and I want to applaud the board and the planning board for hitting all of them in a very comprehensive way. One is patient centricity. It's repeated multiple times in the report and alluded to on the panel already, so I won't repeat that here. I was pleased to see a lot of thoughts about patient engagement. That would be the second pillar. So even specifically on page 54, there is for those of you online who maybe have access to the report, I don't know if anybody has in the room, there's even a little subtitle here, Engaging Patients. And it talks about not just engaging patients in the design and in the process and how they input data and the opportunity for patients to be directly involved, but also in the governance and in the development of it. And I think that's very important. So when we talk, a lot of patient organizations, including mine, put a lot of emphasis on patient engagement and patient input, and we're pleased to see FDA and other organizations looking at opportunities to enhance that. And I think it's critically important on page 35 is the schematic, if you will, of the governance structure, which includes a patient protection advisory committee. I also assume that the executive governing board, there's some vision for including patient representation. My only caution there would be, I would like to see the scope of that to be beyond just patient protection. I don't know what was entailed in that, but clearly the value of this to patient goes beyond just protecting the patient. And I think my other comments will flesh that out a little bit further. The third pillar is value, and there's actually references, on, I think it's page 56, it says patient value, which I think is really important, and I think that speaks to the fact that there it is, subtitle, patient value. So you hit them all, and then it's not just in those places, it's throughout. But I think it's a very nuanced subject, the subject of value, and I think there's some comments already that were alluded to about this. When we look at value, we certainly focus on safety and efficacy, and those are very important things. But we also look at value in terms of innovation. So one of the things that we know is that patients really want value to better medications, better devices, and they want them as fast as possible. So I certainly applaud Jeff's acknowledgments of that in his comments. I think when we look at value, though, it's not just about efficacy, it's about how patients perceive value. And I think when you talk about things like patient-reported outcomes, you have to go beyond, when you're looking at it from the patient perspective, some of those raw sort of clinical outcomes measures that we look at and try to think about what brings value to the patient. And oftentimes, the value is not necessarily, breakthrough is great. We love those, that's what we look for. But incrementalism and continuous innovation is also important. And if you don't think that's important to the market or consumers, I ask you, is there a breakthrough between the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 5? That is certainly an example of a continuous innovation, but look at how the market clamors to change and upgrade from one step to the next. So there is definitely value in incremental improvements in technology and the benefit to the patient. So I would just would want to make sure that's incorporated into the thought process here. And the final point I'd like to make, and this is a bit of a cautionary tale, and I think I actually wrote the words, you can strike a balance, which Jeff actually alluded to, and Lewis, I think your comments as well. There's advantages to the clinical trial process and the controlled environment, which we gathered, that there are also disadvantages I think have been alluded to. Once you transfer into the post-market environment, there's a lot of benefit to gathering real-world data from that. We certainly applaud that, but also understand there's dangers there as well in terms of the signals that may just be noise. And I think from a patient perspective, we always worry about what's going to happen to from an access perspective if you get a safety signal that somehow gets broadcast, and then there's overreaction, and now patients who are benefiting from that device or that drug are now facing access and coverage issues because of that signal that may have been nothing ultimately or may have been isolated. So that's just a cautionary tale. I'm sure that will be worked into the thought process here. And the final point I'll make is still around value and innovation. There was one reference to value or the benefit to this from an innovation perspective on page 18 that said, access to new and novel medical technology is an additional benefit for patients and consumers. And I would just like, I think you kind of alluded to it, Jeff, I guess what I would like to see more of is how would a robust post-market system like this, how would that make sure that innovation is accelerated? And I think the concept is that you do less on the pre-market side, and because you have a much more robust post-market surveillance system. So I just would like to make sure that as we're building this, it's a great opportunity, I think, if the concept is to not try to build a huge barrier on the pre-market side, but really use the post-market side as a way to then get products and devices to patients faster, especially those that show great promise, and then you get those in the hands of patients, have a robust post-market environment in which to continue to evaluate those. But I know that the planning board doesn't have much control on what's happening on the pre-market side, but I would just make sure that all of us in this room who value access to innovative therapies and expedited approval mechanisms think about making sure that if we're going to support this, that we're making sure on the pre-market side that we're not erecting a whole lot of other barriers and trying to build a really big system if we're going to try to do most of the heavy lifting on the post-market side as it relates to devices, because otherwise I think you're going to lose some of the opportunity of faster approvals and supporting for the expedited approval process that a system like this might bring. I know it's a nuanced point, and those of you who haven't read the report yet probably are going, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but those of you who have, hopefully it resonates with you. The last point is, and we actually engage in health equity initiatives. The common denominator between the patients we serve is low income. They have an average household income of less than $23,000, about 60% of the patients. And I would just counsel to make sure that as you're talking about patients engaging in the system, particularly from a data collection and a information perspective, that you think about cultural competency and how the different levels of types of patients that you want to engage from an income perspective, from a data sort of savvy perspective, and from a racial and ethnic perspective, because not everybody is on the same playing field at all when it comes to engaging the system, especially from a data capture and a data utilization perspective. So at the end of my time, thank you for the opportunity to comment on behalf of patients.
Alan, thank you very much. I'll go next to Jody.
Great, thank you. First, I want to thank Brookings and the FDA for including ONC both on the planning board as well as on this panel. I also want to compliment the Brookings staff who really helped facilitate a robust conversation and incorporated a lot of diverse comments in a report to come up with a really good product. It was a lot of work, and it was very much appreciated. I want to make 3 points. The first is about the connection to the work on health IT infrastructure more broadly that I'm involved with at ONC. And the second and third are based on observations and trends I've observed over the last decade in working with ONC, and that I want to make sure are reflected in the longer term thinking on this medical device surveillance system. Some of the points have already been made by some panelists, as well as from Kathleen in going through the report, so I'll keep some of those more shorter. So first, in thinking about the medical device surveillance system, it's really important that this is part of the larger infrastructure and not something that is separate and apart from a lot of the other activity that's going on. And this has come up in a couple of the comments already. It is electronic health records, health information exchange, a nationwide health information network for information exchange are all important foundations for a lot of activities in a learning health system, including a national medical device surveillance system. It will be dependent on availability of clinical information as well as patient-reported data. Again, something that we're trying to drive to make more easily captured in electronic form and more easily accessible. It requires sharing of the information, and it requires that the information, when it is shared in a way that it can be used for multiple purposes. So for clinical care, as well as for public health purposes, and in this case, for medical device surveillance. ONC recently published an interoperability roadmap. We just put it out in January, so if you haven't taken a look at that, I encourage folks to do so. We do have it open for comment for 60 days. And it bridges from looking at how do we make sure that information is available nationwide for clinical care purposes, but in the long term, in the 10-year vision, it's to support a broader learning health system. The roadmap talks about aligning efforts of the public and private sector. Again, it was a theme that was in this report. And it talks about the fact that we have pockets of interoperability, but trying to bridge from where we are now with pockets of interoperable electronic health information exchange to a broader nationwide goal of electronic health information exchange, which I think when we're talking about the medical device surveillance system, we have to be looking at making sure that information can be available from lots of different sources from all across the country, not just the areas where we have higher penetration of electronic health records, higher exchange of information. There were 4 areas of focus, and I want to talk about these because I think there are similar themes that were in this report and that were in the discussions that the Planning Board had. First is standards. We want to encourage that as folks are looking at taking the next steps on the medical device surveillance system, that we're looking at the standards that are already being developed and adopted for other health IT-related activities, and that those can be leveraged wherever possible, or where new standards may be necessary, that they're compatible with the other standards that are being developed, and that this isn't happening in isolation. Again, looking at compatibility and reuse wherever possible. Governance, which is something that we've talked about in interoperability and is something that was talked about in this report. How can we think about connecting some of the thinking on governance for MDSS and health information exchange more broadly? Incentives for information sharing, again, thinking about the value proposition that Omar had mentioned, and then privacy and security. We had some of the same conversations in the Planning Board discussions as have been happening more broadly with respect to health information exchange and use for a variety of public health purposes and a learning health system. So the overarching point I want to make on this is that we have to make sure that the efforts here are connected or at least complementary with the activities that are going on more broadly across the country on health information capture and health information exchange and health information analytics. We're going to have to connect a lot of these disparate activities if we want to get to that broader vision of a learning health system. And I think that this is actually, this effort can be one of an early example of how we can leverage the infrastructure that we're building for health information exchange more broadly to support improvements in knowledge, research, and products as well as healthcare. Okay, so the second point I wanted to make was about consumer information, and I think both of the Allens on either side of me have made those points very clearly, as well as some of the other speakers. But we've really seen a shift in healthcare from a provider-centric approach to a more provider and patient-engaged approach over the last, I'll say over the last decade since I've been working at ONC, but the shift started happening, I would say, a few years ago, where this has become more of the central to the conversation rather than sort of an, oh yeah, and. I think it's really important, and this came up a lot in the Planning Board discussion and is represented in the report, but I wanted to reiterate it, that making sure that the patients are part of this system, both in collecting and contributing information, as well as getting back information so that there's a value to the patients, I think is critical, and I think will help prove success of these efforts. And the last point I'd like to make is about future-proofing, that as we're setting up and thinking about a medical device surveillance system, we have to think about the fact that the technology, the way data is captured, the way data is being exchanged, the way patients are engaging with technology and information is changing so rapidly, and it will be changing as we're trying to put this in place. So as we're thinking about this, making sure we're thinking about not creating systems that kind of protect or instantiate the status quo, but that can adapt over time. We've seen just in the last 5 years, I would say, changes where everybody has mobile phones, smartphones, and have mHealth apps, remote devices, wearables, Internet of Things. So many changes in such a short period of time. The way we think about capturing data, the way we think about sharing data, and the way we think about analyzing data is going to change dramatically in the next decade. And as we're developing this system, we should be thinking about how best to make it nimble enough that it can adapt with the changes in those areas. I think also some of the changes that we're seeing will improve efficiency and potentially reduce cost in collecting information and analyzing that data, and we want to be able to make sure that a system that is put in place can take advantage of those efficiencies as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody, and thanks to all of you for your careful and thoughtful consideration of the report. Some of you may have been very impressed with Alan's specific page annotations. I do want to let you know that we did actually give the panelists an advanced copy of the report, so they didn't have to come up with all of this just in the last few minutes. But they all took a very diligent look through the report, and I was impressed by how much the comments focused on connections between activities that they all have underway and the recommendations in the report. And I wanted to follow up on a couple of those things, starting with something that almost everybody mentioned, which is the need for laying out a clear value case for this new public-private collaboration around national post-market device surveillance. To Lou and Omar in particular, since, again, building on your experience, you all already have efforts underway that pertain very directly to the kind of safety, benefit, as well as other information relevant to medical products, relevant to the shift towards value that you both emphasized in your remarks. And I'm wondering if you all would mind expanding a little bit on how this effort, based on your own experiences and your sense of where we can go from here, how this effort can best reflect the need for all of these types of evidence coming together, and as Jody emphasized, using data that are collected once for multiple purposes. In particular, FDA is focused on the risks and benefits of medical devices for its regulatory mission of protecting and promoting the public health. But you all have also emphasized issues related to cost, to resource use, to value in the real world. You already have activities that are underway. Lou, you mentioned shared clarity. Omar, I know you all have pilots underway focusing on this shift towards real emphasis on value. How does this national effort connect to and best build upon these efforts that you all have underway already? And how can we recognize that there are some issues and evidence coming out of the system that will be particularly important for FDA, but other aspects that are going to be particularly important for other stakeholders, patients, clinicians, value-focused healthcare systems?
I'll make a few comments, Mark. Thanks. I guess the two things that come to mind have to do with, to your point, I think one of the principles is it's always good to build on what's already out there. I just think not just from a technology point of view, but from an experiential point of view. Shared clarity, for example, some of the things I guess that could be lessons learned. First, it's an example itself of collaboration across sectors. So I guess I would sort of learn more about how that works. The second thing is it's a pretty focused effort. It is not trying to boil the ocean. It essentially does a Pareto analysis around what areas should this effort focus on that will have the highest return, that will give the kind of use case and value proposition that Omar mentioned. The other one that is, well, I'll put it out there because I'm not sure how it fits. Shared clarity is not just an effort to actually do comparative effectiveness research to inform the stakeholders of that effort. It's also an effort that is foundational for a volume purchasing arrangement. So the delivery systems in that group have come together to say we're going to compare devices along different kinds of outcomes. And when we find the one that we like best, we're going to see if we can get a better deal from the manufacturer for that particular device for our system, just like any other group purchasing arrangement. I think that's kind of out of scope for a FDA-led surveillance system. However, I just think it's important to keep in mind that that is of interest because it's part of the value proposition itself. It's part of the value proposition for all the stakeholders. So I think there are some lessons learned, and again, I just would learn from the things that are already out there is, I guess, my summary comment, Mark.
You know, I think including innovation into the picture is pretty important, and that's the way in which you can get quick traction from a lot of different stakeholders. And by that I mean the value proposition that innovation brings. If you can have a comprehensive, multiple stakeholder alliance at that, and define value in financial terms and what each stakeholder gets from it, I think you could use this kind of system as a platform to drive that. Today when we try to create our value-based programs, we essentially look at 3 or 4 steps. We define a disease or condition. We define a time horizon over which you can get value. We try to, under those circumstances, baseline current status in terms of benefit and cost, and then have goals regarding how we can improve those. Now, if you really try to follow those steps, you're actually limiting yourself today if you limit yourself to just two parties, because often the time horizon will be limited because by definition a lot of the value sometimes resides much later than a delivery system gets value for. So if you build a system like this and include lots of others, follow a certain framework, it'll broaden the sorts of activities that we're doing by far, because we're very limited today.
Thank you. And this is a question I think everybody in the panel might address, but let me specifically focus on some comments that Bill and Jody made. Bill, you emphasized that some of the activities today for developing this post-market evidence are pretty, I think the term you used was cumbersome in terms of the registries that are in place now. They don't do what Jody laid out in the, or described in the vision for an interoperability roadmap of a quick ability to capture from electronic systems the key information that's needed in a standard way to put into the kind of frameworks that we're talking about here. Based on, and this is for both Bill and Jody, so based on your experiences so far, any suggestions on how the public-private partnership around medical device surveillance can best and most quickly facilitate reducing those costs and fit in with these other existing efforts that obviously all share the goal of developing better evidence at a lower cost, that turns out to be challenging in practice. Bill?
Yeah, and in the report, it suggests both fact-finding and pilot initiatives, and coming back to evidence of value for all the stakeholders. So I think to the extent that when you get to the point of care, clear evidence of value for patients, for caregivers, for the manufacturers, and that's where the benefit-risk paradigm, I think, comes into place. So for those technologies where there is a real opportunity to have an impact when the data are collected. So, you know, collecting data for data's sake is not necessarily going to be where the benefit is. Collecting data that can be actionable afterwards, I think, is going to be extremely important. And using benefit risk for that, I think, is an important.
And that's very much driving what you're doing now, focusing on clinical trials. Let's get
exactly
the evidence
right.
collection where it's the benefits outweigh the cost.
That's right. So rebalancing pre and post market, and also in the patient-centered benefit risk assessment. And one of the things that came out from some early research that FDA did in the obesity field is that patients had a higher risk tolerance than maybe the agency did, and actually the manufacturers in some respects. And so bringing that into the equation, I think, can help inform where the opportunity and real benefit can be in the early stages.
Jody, that fits with where ONC is headed.
Yeah, and I would make two comments to your points, Mark. One, there are, as I mentioned, there are areas where we have a lot of interoperability in the country and a lot of sharing of health information, and others where it's more rudimentary. We also have some challenges of getting information from one place to another as opposed to within a particular region. I think if we were talking in the report, there's conversations and folks had mentioned having pilots. And perhaps it would be wise to start pilots in areas where the technology advancement and the sharing of information is more ingrained into the clinical setting, where they are working a little bit more with engaging patients using digital technology, so that we can start taking advantage of some of the the areas where they're a little bit ahead of the curve in this space, and I think that might help structure the locations or the areas where pilots might be most effective. The second point I would make is that the report talks about a governing body or governance structure, and one of the key areas of focus for our interoperability roadmap is governance for health information exchange more broadly. Obviously, because we're trying to walk before we run, we're focusing in the next couple of years primarily on clinical exchange of health information. But we want to do that while thinking to the long term as well, so that we're not setting up structures or policies or practices that are limited to that use case, but that can go to a broader scenarios of a learning health system, including medical device surveillance. So I would encourage that if we're taking the next step in thinking about governance for an MDSS, that we make sure, one, to connect with my office, but also as we are trying to set up a governance structure for health information exchange more broadly, that we connect the dots, perhaps include somebody from FDA or somebody who might be involved in trying to set up that governance structure into the broader governance structure for a nationwide health information network.
Thanks. Alan, do you want to comment on this?
You mentioned at the beginning, Mark, the President's Precision Medicine Initiative. And I think there, in some ways, in terms of the last question, if it goes forward as people imagine, you probably know that the larger element of it is a 1 million-plus person longitudinal cohort. And while clearly it has a different focus, somewhat different structure from what we're talking about in terms of the MDS, many design characteristics, at least the desirable ones, are quite similar. And there certainly should be conversation back and forth, depending upon the timing of each of these, I think learning from each other and perhaps even doing some things jointly in terms of the design, clearly in terms of the interoperability and other kinds of features that one would want to have in both systems. And also, once that gets launched, even though it's only 1 million people, first of all, I think many of us suspect it will grow to be much more than 1 million people. Many of those people will have medical devices. And while this certainly wouldn't replace the MDS, those folks will have built into this system very robust phenotypic and other kinds of medical data, et cetera. So to take advantage of that, whether it be as pilots for some of what MDS might do, or simply to accrue even more in-depth data about some of the folks who have devices, I think it's another resource that shouldn't be overlooked.
Alan, thanks. That's an interesting idea for a potential early pilot. Let me go to the other Alan Balch. The report, as you mentioned, does talk about potential pilot activities involving new kinds of patient collected data, which seems like, I think certainly was the planning board's view, that if you really want to shift to a more patient-centric system, that early pilots should focus on exploiting these now rapidly expanding, but as yet not very systematically used sources of data on risk, benefits, costs. You're focusing on a lot for patients. Any further thoughts on how to really make sure that that fits into the early pilot efforts, since it seems like everybody here wants to focus on practical steps forward?
Yeah. So just to be practical, and not necessarily that we're happy to be in the conversation potentially, but there are other organizations out there as well, like ours, that are in the trenches directly with patients every day doing some sort of real-world data collection. So I would encourage the planning board, as they're looking at the initial pilot proposal and the incubator period, to look at opportunities potentially. Now, we don't do it at any level of sophistication that the government systems do or the clinical systems do, but it would be an interesting thing to at least look at to see what opportunities exist within the patient advocacy organization space to collect real-time data or try to capture some of that and help it at least inform, anecdotally perhaps, what the system is gathering.
Thanks. I would like to open up this discussion to those of you here in the room. So we are going to have microphones going around. If you have a question, please just raise your hand, and then I will try to call on you for any of the for any particular topics. Is anyone at the? Okay. See.
One up here.
Up here. If you could say who you are and then ask your question quickly so we can get on to a number of comments.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. I have two questions. One is the public-private partnership seems a very trendy fashion. It's mentioned almost everywhere, every study or every project. I just wonder, how do you value or decide where is the beginning point and where is the ending point? How do you share public and how do you share the private? Whether the public really have the percentage share of their profit. The second is about security. I think this kind of IT probably have a lot of electronic element, but I just wonder if they would be hacked or interrupted or manipulated by unauthorized person. And how do you determine the patient care from their own based on the treatment at that point and the potential storage and benefits?
Thank you, Senator. So two very good questions on public-private partnership. How do you do that effectively? How do you make sure there's an appropriate role for the public and the private side? Bill, do you mind if I turn to you, since you all have some extensive experience on that recently? And then other people on the panel are welcome to comment as well.
Yeah, since we're a public-private partnership, I guess it is appropriate for me to answer this question. And it's engagement of all stakeholders. And the challenge on the public side, on the patient in particular, is going beyond the individual case to a more systemic approach and finding organizations that have a patient-centered approach to the systems aspects of this. And so we've engaged with groups like the National Health Council, Faster Cures, National Organization of Rare Diseases, as groups that are working on and advocating for patients. And then the public group, we obviously, as I mentioned before, have NIH, CMS, FDA at the table, and then we have industry partnerships. So it's really bringing all of the constituents together, and the opportunity is to have shared voice discussion as opposed to, if you will, we versus they. It's getting everybody together and identifying and agreeing that this is a problem we want to work on, and then bringing the stakeholders collaboratively together to do it. And I think our experience has been, and we've seen some recent results in terms of surveys that would say that this is having a positive impact in terms of both improving the quality and performance of devices, but also on the innovation pathway, especially in the regulatory side. The reimbursement's still a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Just to add to that, and Omar, if you have a comment on this as well, on another point that I know has been a big issue for you and for the other public-private partnerships that we studied is transparency, so making sure that it's easy for anyone who's interested to get access to what's going on, and there's an opportunity for full participation. And then kind of a reminder that because these public-private partnerships accomplish some things that government can't do, it's not diminishing the role of the public sector. So FDA in these cases still has exactly the same responsibilities and authorities it had before, and the intent here, I think, is to provide more support, more scientific evidence, more technical clarity, and more resources behind the
Yeah, that's a good point, and thanks for bringing that up. We work in the pre-competitive space on regulatory science, and so it does not at all have any involvement or scope that goes into the product review and approval mission of FDA.
And here, too, is envisioned for device surveillance. This is evidence that FDA can use, but it's still FDA making the decisions, the regulatory decisions, not any public-private partnership. Omar?
Yeah, well, I think on this point, there are two aspects of a public-private partnership, and we've only really touched on one here. And we've touched on the governance aspect. That's what we really talked about, that everybody's involved, that everyone's view gets engaged, and you govern it through both public stakeholders and private stakeholders. I think, though, there is another aspect to this which is more specific, which could be a sort of an adjacent public-private partnership building off of this model, which takes into account very specific value propositions. And there, if I can take an example, two examples. One being where you get accelerated device approval. Well, clearly the FDA has to be involved in that. That's the public part of it, if you like, and the private could be the delivery system, the manufacturer, and the payers who could benefit from that accelerated device approval. But you've got to tie down, what it is you're trying to do, and what value you'll get from it, and create a real venture between these organizations so that each of their financial benefits or other benefits that they're looking for from this, that they can get in a very clear fashion. Another example could be just working with Medicare or Medicaid in some very specific area where there's a public organization who's actually a payer. And so working together with a delivery system and a manufacturer to come up with a partnership that delivers, again, some kind of value based on this kind of system is another kind of public-private partnership. So there's one which is governance and another which is true business creation.
Identifying that shared value.
And identifying a shared value and then creating a business around it. And I don't think the two are different, but they're not mutually exclusive.
No,
and we can build one on the other.
And important to consider both. And just if we do have time at the end, I'll give you all a little bit of advance warning. I was thinking about a lightning round final question to this point on, okay, what are give us an example of this kind of high value area where the MDS, public-private partnership, should be thinking about its initial focus. But before we get to that, very good question about protecting privacy and confidentiality of patient data. Does anybody want to comment on that one?
Well, I think that's absolutely a very important point.
Yeah.
And I think maybe in the governance structure and the stakeholders, we've got to get some real expertise who are focused as functional experts on security. We could miss that one.
Yeah, I will comment. I think it's actually a really important point. It's something that we are struggling with as well with respect to health information exchange more broadly. And there are, when we talk about interoperability of health information and sharing of health information, the technical challenges are there, but the real challenges are trust that the system will work as intended, that the information will be secure and protected, and it'll be used in ways that meet people's expectations. And I think it's actually one of the most critical things that we need to deal with, both for this system as well as for health information exchange more broadly, is how do we ensure a level of confidence and trust that the information is protected at the right level, and that there. We can't prevent all security breaches from ever happening, but what's the right level of security that strikes the balance between making sure information is available for important public health needs, but also protects the information from unauthorized uses? So I think it's a very critical question. There are conversations at ONC, there are conversations at the White House on this topic, on the Hill, and I think it's one of the things that a governance organization, a governance body will have to address. It's something that has occurred in the health information exchange efforts that have taken place to date, where everybody has agreed to a particular level of security so that the information can be shared comfortably between different partners. So I think you raise an important point, and it's something that we should make sure is appropriately addressed.
And that we be transparent about whatever that level of security is, so that everyone involved in the system knows both what it can do and what the limitations are.
Correct.
Right. So this is highlighted in the governance, the goals of the governance part of the organization, as noted, as you all have noted. We'll also come back to this topic this afternoon, I think, when we have some discussion around more extensively around how this effort fits into other efforts to develop better evidence while protecting patient privacy and confidentiality in the healthcare system. For example, I think Rich Platt will probably talk or may talk a bit about some of the efforts that have been undertaken in the FDA's Sentinel initiative on drug safety, in which the patient identifiable information largely stays at the source, and that what comes out of that system is really just the summary information on patients exposed to a drug and the rates of adverse events. So other questions? Yeah, up here.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. I'm wondering, what is the international dimension of all of this, if any? Do we have things to learn from other countries? Are they coming to us to learn? Are we collaborating with them in any way? Surely the manufacturers are dealing worldwide.
Comments on that? I know many of you are involved in global efforts. Omar, Lou, others.
You go first, Lou.
Why don't you go first?
It's a very polite panel, isn't it?
It's a tough question. Look, obviously there are governments around the world and healthcare systems around the world where similar efforts are taking place. I think the UK with NICE and also some other activities that are going on there. You have done some useful work, and we're learning from those. But at this stage, I think you've got to do this country by country because it's complex enough even within one country. If you start bringing in global stakeholders into the same program, it's just going to get too. Now you can learn from others and do parallel approaches with some selected countries where they have a desire to do this. But we can achieve a lot just by doing it just within the U.S.
So data sources, data infrastructure, and governance, national, but international opportunities to develop methods,
look at best
compare
practice
findings,
and learn from each other, but to make it an international data source will make it very different.
Lou?
I would add, I think probably the one thing that comes to my mind that we can learn from international efforts have been around registries. Internationally, the use of clinical registries is much more advanced than in the U.S. There's broader depth and scope of those registries to really inform patients and inform practitioners about what is best. Having said that, I do agree with Omar. I think we can learn from that, but each country has its own regulatory approach, and they have their own views around privacy, different regulatory structures around privacy. So I think we can learn, but I think I think we have to start with what works best in the U.S., given our environment.
Time for one more question, and I'm going to back here.
Hi there, Anna McAllister-Slip. I have a company called Galileo Analytics, but I'm here as somebody who lives very close to here and is a nerd and as a type 1 diabetes patient. One thing that I often said is that the best people who can report issues with their devices are the patients. And while diabetes devices are different than some of the other implantable devices, there doesn't seem to be that much of an effort to incorporate the knowledge of the crowd of patients and the community of patients. And I was wondering, I mean, as for those of you like Jody who worked with me on the FDASIA work group, one of my favorite models that I used to talk about is adopting sort of an app store approach to issues reporting so that we could get a constant iteration and a feedback loop between the users and the manufacturers and enable this constant iteration that has propelled consumer technology so very, very effectively. And I was wondering if the planning board and the others involved in this effort at this point has looked at any kind of crowdsourcing-esque model. Obviously, it doesn't exist now at FDA, but the technology has changed tremendously just in the past couple of years, and I would love to see this sort of, whether it's patients or physicians, this sort of crowdsourcing-based model so that we can find out issues faster. And I think that would be better for the agency, that would be better for patients and physicians.
Yeah, I can speak on behalf of the planning board. I can say that they definitely considered and want to incorporate in this program crowdsourcing or other patient-reported information into this systematic approach for surveillance. That hasn't happened yet, but the potential is there. I think Sally Oken may talk later on today about some of the adverse event and other information that patients like me captures. You all probably get more adverse event reports at this point than the FDA, but would like to hear from any views on the panel about how to go about incorporating this kind of information. Another good challenging question, but
I think it's a great concept. I think it's worth considering, and I would just sort of dovetail that with my earlier point about there's a lot of opportunity from the application and sort of crowdsourcing and social media component, but there's still a lot of people that have devices and have need for these that have that kind of technology, that kind of approach won't work. So they're not, I'm sure you didn't mean to suggest that would be the only thing, but I think as you're doing those kind of things that could potentially reach a certain patient population in a very direct and real-time and interactive way, which might be interesting to consider, if not anecdotally, but also to consider other ways to reach more difficult, and that's probably that's a challenge in and of itself. What's even more challenging is how do you reach those populations that aren't as connected to that type of technology and aren't going to engage. And the only reason I bring that point up is because I think there's certainly access barriers and lots to learn from those who are engaged in that sort of social media environment. But it does tend to be, if any of you do online research, kind of know the difference that you get statistically between an online population typically and say a phone-based survey, or if you're sort of taking calls from patients who have need. Of course, that's selection bias, so again, can't be part of a robust system. But I think you do start to encounter, the patient population that is most likely to be out of the access loop as well, and encountering a lot of barriers, not just from a maybe safety or efficacy perspective, but are encountering other barriers that are wrapped around that. So I think to make sure that whole perspective and the continuum of perspective from the patient population needs to represent everything from those that are accessing the system through the hospital system, those that are maybe can provide information from some sort of crowdsourcing of social media. But there's got to be, and it's really hard to do, how do you reach that patient that is most likely to be on the periphery of the system and getting lost in the system or falling through the cracks of the system? They have a lot of value to add too. And I only bring it up because I think you're seeing this, we do worry a lot about health disparities, and that's a very important point. But I think the risk with accelerating innovation is you don't want to, as part of accelerating innovation, is accelerate the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and those who have access and good coverage and those who do not, who may have coverage but may not necessarily have good access. So I know that's another one of those, boy, if you hadn't answered that question, I call them the grassy knoll questions or comments, like I'm just throwing out something that nobody knows how to do, but hey, it's nice to talk about. It's the Brookings Institute. We can be sort of academic here as well.
We definitely want to include that.
I would make one point, since I was on the planning board as well as on the panel. There was a lot of conversation about how we bring in the insights from patients, the information from patients into an MDSS. And there was a lot of support for that and for trying to do that right and do that well. I don't think that the planning board necessarily identified the best way to get patient information. I think, to Alan's point, there may be multiple ways of doing that and not just one way. Social media may be one way. Maybe there's mobile health tools that are another way. There may be, et cetera. But one of the points that was made in the report is that in the governance structure, it's critical to have patient representation on that to help raise those issues and to help identify what might be the best mechanisms, the best ways of trying to get the patient information, the patient perspective into the analysis and into the information that's being shared for an MDSS. And so I think, you're one step ahead of where the planning board probably was, but there was a strong recognition that patients need to be part of the discussion, the governance, as well as the data and the output, so that it is benefiting, one, we have the best information possible, and two, that we're providing a benefit to the most important entity in this whole thing, which is the patients that are benefiting from the devices themselves.
We are about out of time, and it's been a great discussion focusing on practical considerations and next steps. Lightning round, as I warned you before. Final thoughts very quickly on specific things that should happen in this process to make sure we get to that value, that clear value proposition quickly. Omar, start with you.
Well, first, like I've said before, pick off specific projects with defined value propositions, with clear stakeholder benefits, and go for it. But, actually the last comment raised certain thoughts. And the way I'd like to go with that is to say that speed and agility in this process is paramount, because the sources of data that we have today, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, will be different. And we've got to have a system that adapts to that. Otherwise, you'll build a system for 2010 and 2025, and that's not going to work. So speed and agility is the one that I would say that get moving on something, define value, and go do it.
Great, Bill.
So we talked a lot about evidence of value and benefit risk, and I think to go along with that, or to complement that, is identifying where, once we put this basic infrastructure in place, where there is also clinical diagnostic infrastructure that is already established and developed that can be useful tools of information. So if you're developing a hypertension device, having blood pressure is an important thing, but if we're developing a new breakthrough technology, there may not be the analytics in place yet. So identify areas of focus where there's analytics available that will be valuable when you get done with the process.
And actually answer the practical questions. Lou.
To safety and innovation. I would like, as soon as possible, to be able to have a robust system that uses the UDI so that we can, if there is a safety issue, we can alert the population of patients that has that device, either to notify them or for a recall. So that's number one. And then the second one is innovation. Very typical kind of conversation we have, United Healthcare will have. An innovator says, we have something that is better. It's much more costly, but it's better. And we say, well, we actually don't have any evidence that it's better, or we have insufficient evidence that it's better. If this system can help create the infrastructure so that when someone says it's better in this respect, this respect, this respect, we can rapidly get that answer so that we can have an informed decision at a policy level, that would be a real win.
Thank you.
I would say that one of the real benefits of this would be better research of many different types, and therefore we should have researchers of many different types be involved in designing the system to make sure that happens.
I think my key point takeaway is making sure that as we're taking the next steps, that we're building on the infrastructure that's already starting to flesh out for health information exchange more broadly, looking at the standards that already exist and reusing them wherever possible, reusing the infrastructure wherever possible, so that we're not reinventing the wheel, and that we can improve efficiencies in the system and put patients at the center of this whole system. because we will get better results and more value to the patients if we do.
Similar comment. I think the planning board was very much on the right path already by really making this a very patient-centric effort. And I think the more that continues throughout this whole process, that the patients are at the center of it, not just in terms of the value that they may derive as one of the end users, but really as an active member and an engaged member of the process. And not just your typical patient, but trying to cast a pretty broad net to capture a pretty broad patient perspective, representative of the different types of income levels and racial and ethnic disparity issues across the organization. I know that's hard to do, but I think the end product will represent more something that will be useful to all patients if you go through it from that, look at it from that sort of approach. And the other point that I would make very quickly is, and I've made it already, so I won't belabor it, but the patient value piece is make sure that as you go through this process and you're thinking about patient-reported outcomes and clinical evidence, that the value, you think about how, and we have some data that we can share and others do about how do patients perceive value, which is oftentimes a very different thing than thinking about the outcomes data or the efficacy. They're interrelated, but that you can get a very different answer from a patient when you ask them, did you value the care that you received? So just to give you a little anecdote, when we ask that question of our patient population, it's kind of like when you ask people, do you approve of Congress? No, don't like Congress. Do you like your congressman? Oh, I love him. So we get the same sort of response. Do you like the system? How's it working for you? No, not working for me. How is your care? Did you value your care? Oh, 10. My provider was a 10. My healthcare team was a 10. I got great value of care, even in patients who may not be seeing the outcomes that are not in remission. So I think that's just an interesting point to keep in mind, that value from a patient perspective may be a different way to look at it than how we, clinicians or providers or other evidence-based groups may look at it. So thank you for the opportunity.
And I'd like to thank you and the rest of the panel for the very thoughtful and constructive initial feedback on the report. It gives a good foundation for going forward. Thank you all very much. Now,